Yeah. So should we jump straight into it, or do people want a few minutes?
I think so. I think probably jump straight in. We've only had one talk. People should have had dinner and had toilet breaks and things. So anyone want to have a break or jump straight in? No, let's jump into it. Go for it,
Right.
Pete.
So hopefully you can see that now.
Yep, can see it fine.
Cool. Right. So a Tailsitter update, as Tridge says, we've been doing quite a few things. So Tailsitters are much improved in 4.2. So I will cover sort of some of the updates that we've been doing, and hopefully we'll get lots of people building lovely Tailsitters. So first of all, what is a Tailsitter? So I think that the key thing is not actually that it sits on its tail, it's that it hovers at a different attitude to that it uses in forward flight. And we do actually support Tailsitters that do not tail sit, which is a bit of a weird thing. So this is an example of the Convair Pogo, so a famous manned big Tailsitter. So you can see it does sit on its tail, and then it transitions and flies like a normal plane. And these Tailsitters were actually the first like proper VTOL aircraft. So Tailsitters were there first. You don't see them very much anymore, which perhaps tells us something, but they were the first. So we support lots of different types in ArduPilot, and these are a collection of some of them. So we've got this sort of dual motor Tailsitter, which at least in ArduPilot is the very sort of the when people say Tailsitter, people often think of this sort of dual motor Tailsitter. So we've got two motors that do the roll control, and then we've got big control surfaces for doing yaw and pitch. Of course, we do also support single motor. So this will be like a 3D aircraft. So you can prop hang. So ArduPilot can also prop hang with 3D aircraft again. You need massive control surfaces because the control surfaces are your only form of control here. So you've got roll, pitch, and yaw just from control surfaces on these aircraft. And we've got vectored Tailsitters. So you don't need the massive control surfaces anymore because you generate your pitch and yaw forces by vectoring the motors. And of course, roll is still by differential thrust. And then we support these so-called copter Tailsitters. So that's basically a copter with a wing. So we get roll, pitch, and yaw from differential thrust and differential torque, just like a copter would. And then we've got a wing in the middle. And in fact, you don't really need control surfaces. You probably should have control surfaces, as we'll discuss it a little bit later on, but you don't need them. And then this is another example of a so-called copter Tailsitter, and this one does have control surfaces. And then this Swan K1 is actually quite a nice vehicle because I think it's the first sort of off-the-shelf Tailsitter that we actually support. So you can just go and buy one and flash ArduPilot and you're done. So that's the sort of the types we support. There's lots of variations on these types, but these are the main few. So there's a little demo video of the various Tailsitters to watch as we discuss what this talk's going to be. So that's a Tailsitter there that didn't take off on its tail. So that's a thrust-vectored Tailsitter. These are all Henry's various vehicles. Off it goes there. So first of all, I'll cover some of the smaller little bitty changes that we've done. Then we'll have a look at the control surface gain scaling methods, the new minimum outflow parameters. It's one of these copter Tailsitters there. Just popped up. Then we'll talk a little bit about control surfaceless Tailsitters. There's quite a lot of interest in those, it seems. We'll cover transitions briefly and sort of have a look at some logs of transitions, and then we'll talk about the new weathervaning functionality for Tailsitters. It's a thrust-vectored Tailsitter, again, one that doesn't take off on its tail, and that's the Swan K1 there. So Henry's got, I think Henry's got one of every different sort of tailsitter in his box of toys. And I think that's the last variation. So these are the sort of smaller changes that have little fix-ups and things like that are not massive changes that you would notice, but sort of little itty-bitty stuff that got fixed in the background. So first of all, the big change if you're setting up a tailsitter on 4.2 is that we've now got this Q tailsit enable parameter. So importantly, if you don't care about tailsitters, right, it hides all the parameters, so you don't have to see all these tailsit parameters that you don't need. So that's useful. And we've also done the same for tilt rotors. So it means us tailsitter users don't have to see all the tilt rotor parameters. And it removes, in 4.1, we had some like weird combinations, like you had to set Q frame class to tailsitter, or you could set Q flame class to something else, and then you had to set Q tailsit motor mix. So there was sort of weird combinations of these two parameters that enabled tailsitters or not. So the key thing here, if you've got Q tailsit enable, you're a tailsitter, and you can use whatever frame class you like. So that's a sort of nice improvement. I think it makes it very clear if you're a tailsitter or not. We got the ability to set level in both reference frames. So if you do your set level in forward mode, it will set the roll and pitch trim, and then you can sit it on its tail and do the set level again, and it will set pitch and yaw. So that's a nice little improvement to get your trim exactly right. We can now transition to and from inverted forward flight. So usually you would sort of pitch over forwards and shoot off upright. And if you've got your inverted flight switch set in forward flight, it will pitch over backwards and shoot off upside down. Now we've got a dedicated build for the Swan K1. So as I said earlier, you can just go and buy one of these. You go and flash the dedicated build, all the parameters are there, flash the build, go and fly. So that's super nice, and hopefully we'll see a bit more sort of off-the-shelf tailsitters in the future. I think as I said, I think that's the first one. It would be nice if we could get some more sort of ready-to-fly autopilot tailsitters would be great. And then we fixed. So this was a really weird EKF issue. So people were often seeing this yaw inconsistent warning on tailsitters, and it turned out there was a bug in the EKF, how it init, that when you were sat on your tail with this exact 90-degree pitch up, as far as the EKF was concerned, this exact 90-degree pitch up, the init went wrong. So Paul fixed that for us. It was quite a weird one. If you were just 5 degrees off from the vertical, it was fine, but exactly vertical, and we got this init issue. So everyone with tailsitters was getting this yaw inconsistent message. So that's been fixed. So you should be not see that anymore. So first of all, I'm going to cover the gain scaling method, and I'm going to explain how the new disk theory gain scaling works and how you can set it up. So this is primarily for like control surface tailsitters. So either dual motor or single motor tailsitters. If you've got enormous control surfaces, it's worth setting this up. If you've just got little control surfaces and you've got vectoring, or you're a copter tailsitter and you've got lots of control power from either the vectoring or being a copter, it won't make much difference. But for these sort of dual motor tailsitters where you need the massive control surfaces, this can make quite a nice improvement. As it says here, right, so we rely on the airflow from the props over the wing. Obviously, when you're hovering, there's no sort of natural airspeed on the vehicle, so your control is all coming from the outflow of the propeller blowing straight over the control surface here. So you don't see any pusher tailsitters because you rely on the airflow coming back off the propeller over the control surface. So this is a new option. So we've got several gain scaling methods, and in this, to set this disk loading method up, you need to set your gain scale max to 4 and your set your disk loading parameter. So you've got to have them both set, and we'll discuss this disk loading in the next few slides. So there's been a lack of equations in this conference so far, I thought. So I'm trying to make up for lost time here. So a few equations, I'm afraid. So this is sort of the actuator disk theory, it's called, and it's derived from Bernoulli's equation. There's a link there if you want to go and see how it's derived. So it's just a control volume here, and you'll sort of intuitively understand this, right? If you hold your hand above a propeller, you don't really feel the air getting sucked in. But if you put your hand behind the propeller, you see there's this huge sort of tube of wind, tube of airflow. And you can definitely see this on copters. You know, if you're hovering over grass, you can see very sort of a strong sort of tube of air, right? So this is sort of disk theory. And then this is the equation. So we've got thrust is air density, the area of your disk here, the exit velocity, which is the velocity at the end of our control volume here, minus the inflow velocity at the top here, and just divided by 2. So we've got these sort of 2 stream tubes here. So it's drawn as 2, right? In actuality, we just do 1, and you add up all your propellers as if they were 1. So if you had, you know, 2 props, it would just be 1. Sort of it does the math once for a bigger propeller that was of equivalent area. So that's our stream tube there. So that's our equation derived from Bernoulli there. So then we rearrange that to give exit velocity. So the thing we want is this exit velocity, because that's the velocity that's acting on the control surface here. So if we can work out that velocity, we can scale the control surface so that the response is the same no matter what the throttle level is and how fast we're going and stuff like that. So we rearrange to give that exit velocity here. So just rearrange the equation, and then obviously we don't actually know what thrust is. So but we do know what our current throttle is, and we do know what the hover throttle is. So we say that
I think Peter got muted.
I've lost audio from.
He's muted.
From Pete. He muted.
You hear me now?
Oh, there you go. Back again. Yeah, you muted all of a sudden, Pete.
Weird. Right. I don't know where I got to. So
too many equations. That's what did it.
Yeah,
you're on
point 3.
Point 3.
Point 3. Okay, so we say you know, throttle is linear. We've got our thrust expo, so everyone's gone and set that properly. So we've got this linear throttle relationship, so that we say our thrust is equivalent to our throttle over hover throttle times the mass of the vehicle. So we know that at hover throttle, the thrust equals the mass of the vehicle, right? Otherwise, you'd be climbing up or descending. So we substitute that in for thrust here, and then that gives us our equation for outflow speed. And then we have this cunning realization. We've got a M here and an area here. So that's actually disk loading. So we've got mass over disk area. So that gives us our disk loading. So that is our new parameter, Q-tailsit disk loading. So that accounts for both the vehicle mass and the size of your propellers. So as a first step, you can just go and set this, right? You know how heavy your vehicle is. You know the radius of your propellers, so you can just calculate this. And if you've got a bunch of propellers, you just add up the area of all of them and just set that. And obviously, you don't need to change this for you know, if you add payload or whatever, like just set it up once and you're good to go. So then we have to normalize by hover throttle, right? So that in the hover case, you always have a gain of 1, so as that you can go and change all the parameters and it still remains the same for hover. And it also means that, you know, if you turn on this gain, you get a gain of 1 in hover. We don't start off with some massive gain and you have to go and change all your PIDs. So in the In the hover case, we know that throttle hover is 1, and we have 0 inflow velocity in the hover. And then in the general case, we've got the inflow velocity is from an airspeed sensor if you have one, and if you don't have one, we use synthetic airspeed. So then this is our final scaling. This big long equation gives us the ratio of the exit velocity to hover. So then we have always a scaling of 1 in hover, so you can go and change these. You can go and change your disk loading and stuff, and it will always be 1 at hover. And that is true for all the scaling methods. So you can also just go and change to a different scaling method. The scaling will always be 1 at hover. So you don't have to change your gains if you change the scaling. It'll always be the same in hover. And then we constrain the scaling. So we've got a minimum and a maximum. So you don't get like a divide by 0 and your scaling shoots off to infinity and the control surfaces can't keep up and stuff. So you can go and set this if you need to, so it doesn't sort of saturate your control surface and shoot off to infinity. So that all seems very straightforward, right? But actually, actually you can see, this stream tube actually doesn't cover 100% of our control surface, right? There's a bit on either side that is not covered, right? And maybe you've got a longer wing, and there's a bit more control surface that you don't cover. So you actually have to sort of fudge this disk loading value that you went and calculated exactly. You actually have to sort of fudge it a bit to make up for the fact that not all of your control surface is actually in this exit velocity. So you want to change it such that you get sort of the average velocity. So if half the control surface is in this sort of stream tube, you just half the disk loading, so that on average you get sort of the average airflow over that area. And then well, that still won't be perfect. You still need to sort of tune it in a bit. So the trick to doing that is just to cover a wide range of airspeeds and a wide range of throttles. So I tend to just pin the throttle to full, so you climb really fast and then you chop the throttle low. So that covers a range of airspeeds, while at high throttle, when you sort of accelerate upwards, you get a range of airspeeds, and then when you chop the throttle, you get a range of airspeeds at low again, and you just lower the disk loading if you see oscillations at high throttle, and hopefully then you should be good to go. And the key thing here is that we account for the inflow speed here. So when you're moving fast, we scale down, which the other scaling methods didn't do. So it should mean that you can fly around with more airspeed, wider range of throttle without getting into oscillations. And because all the scalings are 1 at hover, right, the closer you stay to your hover condition, the less you'll notice. But if you like razzing about or flying in Q acro and going fast and stuff, you should see some really nice improvements with this methodology.
Pete, quick question. What are the units of the disk loading? In other words, what are you going to use? What do you use for the units? And that was the first question.
So the units are sort of kilograms per meter squared, right? But I didn't put units on the parameter because you have to fudge it, right? You still have to tune it. If there were real units, it would imply that there was a right value for a vehicle. You would just calculate it. So you can't just calculate it, but the starting point would be that mass over area calculation, which would be kilograms per meter squared.
And the tuning by high throttle and low, is that in VTOL?
Yep. So this is all in VTOL. So this is only used in VTOL mode. I should have probably had that on the first line. Sorry. Yeah. So you're right, Randy. We could totally apply this to coax copters and stuff like that. So basically, anything with control surfaces that are sort of acted on via the propeller airflow. I mean, you could use it in forward flight in planes, of course, but in planes you'll find that the dominant effect is the forward airspeed of the vehicle, right? The plane, the relative airflow from the props is quite low because you've got this forward speed. But in our case, we've no forward speed, and we've got this huge effect from the props, and we also tend to have massive control surfaces, which you do need, but it means you have to get the scaling right.
So what if you're in semi-hybrid flight? In other words, you're in very, I think you touched on it, but very fast VTOL flight with horizontal translation.
Yep. So this should work for that. Should work.
Does it mix the partial airspeed? You know, if you're going 10 meters a second.
Yep. So we've got our airspeed is this this term here. So we've got a plus V0 from airspeed. So it's a combination. So on the left here is the airspeed from the propeller, and then we've got the airspeed from the vehicle moving forward.
Okay, but it's still only VTOL. So if you're in a fixed wing mode in high alpha, it's relying just on the normal fixed wing speed scaling.
Exactly. Yeah. But of course you can set up your Q assist speed and stuff. So you could actually transfer to use this controller at low airspeed if you wanted to do sort of fancy high alpha stuff, if you needed to. So that is this sort of disk theory gain scaling, which does seem to show quite a nice improvement. But I would only bother setting up, right, if you're one of these tailsitters that relies on the control surfaces. So you've got enormous control surfaces. It's not worth it for copter tailsitters. It will work, but you probably won't see much benefit because you've only your control surfaces are sort of sized for forward flight. They're not big enough that it would make a massive difference in that case. Right, so then we've got our disk theory stuff. So actually there's a little extension we can make to this disk theory calculation that we can sort of specify a minimum outflow speed. So we can say, I need at least this much airspeed over my control surfaces to maintain control. So then we increase the throttle such that you always have that much airspeed. So in 4.1, often people would set like a bit of a higher spin min so that their propeller would never sort of go slow enough that you lost this nice airspeed over your control surfaces. So that does work, although setting high spin min has other problems, like you mess up your expo and stuff like that. But using our new disk theory equations, it allows us to sort of benefit from having super low throttle. So if you've built up some airspeed, you can chop to a very low throttle. And if you're hovering, you have a sort of bit of a higher throttle limit. And it also means you can potentially descend a bit better because it is a limit like at the motors level. So people often have to set quite a high, quite a low descent rate on their tailsitters because you're trying to fly a plane backwards. So you have to set a really low descent rate, which works. But then if you get a gust of wind that pushes you up, the vehicle tries to then catch up with the descent rate, and it descends a bit too fast, and you're trying to fly a plane backwards. It doesn't work. So we can use our same equations to derive a throttle level that will maintain at least the airflow specified in the over the control surfaces. So the param is Q tailsit min VO. So tailsitter minimum outflow velocity. So we've got our same equation for thrust, but this time we rearrange for throttle here. So we've got, again, the same equation, rearrange for throttle. Exit velocity is set by min, the new parameter. And then in the climb case, we can use airspeed here from the airspeed sensor. This should be the descent case. Obviously, the airspeed sensor doesn't work if you're trying to descend, right? The airspeed sensor doesn't read negative airspeed. So if you're descending, if the airspeed is 0, we use the body frame x velocity. So we sort of have to guess the airspeed, since you can't measure backwards airspeed, and that gives us this sort of minimum throttle level. And then we apply that to the motor's back end. So you do have to be careful. If you set this too high, the minimum throttle will be above hover and it will just climb. So you can make your vehicle fly away if you set this too high. So sneak up on it carefully. And the other thing to watch out for is that it's limited by our throttle mix parameters. So you might need to set a higher throttle mix to allow the motors library to boost up the throttle. So these throttle mix parameters, there's a min for landing, I think. There's a maximum for like auto throttle modes, and there's a manual for manual throttle modes. So you might have to increase those a bit, which allows the motors library to bump up the throttle for more than it's being asked for. Again, you will need to tune this in. So a nice way to tune it is to just descend and stabilize, like lower the throttle stick as much as you can and stabilize, and then set this parameter such that you don't, like if you chop the throttle completely very low, right, it won't stabilize. So you just increase this parameter until you can descend. So you won't descend as fast, but you should also descend level. It should keep control whilst descending. And we just do that by bumping up the throttle to get this minimum outflow speed. So you do have to have set up the disk loading stuff. So you need to be using the disk loading gain scaling. You can see we've got our disk loading term in here again, a disk over m. So that covers that stuff. So then control surfaceless. We get lots of interest on the forum, people wanting to set up control surfaceless vehicle. I do think it's a bad idea. You'll find that as you gain airspeed, your prop effectiveness decreases. So your props make less and less thrust, and the aerodynamic forces increase, which basically means your vehicle has a speed limit. If you fly too fast, you lose control. So we do support it though, but control surfaces are very nice.
They're a lot of fun to fly, but yeah, that you can get some very interesting crashes.
Yeah. So there's a magic Q tailsitter enable equals 2. So that's the sort of thing you need to set if you haven't got any control surfaces. So this enables active stabilization in forward flight from the motors, and it also forces sort of air mode is what we'd call it if it was a VTOL mode. So it forces air mode. So that means if you go to 0 throttle, stabilization remains active. So you need stabilization all the time to keep your attitude control. So it forces this air mode in forward flight. Otherwise you find, like when you try and so you're doing an RTL or something and it tries to descend, it'll go to 0 throttle and lose attitude control. So we force on this air mode that sort of keeps the stabilization always active, and it does work very well. You can fly around at high alpha and do all sorts of things that normal planes couldn't do. You just have to be a bit careful not to go too fast and lose control. And again, that's the Swan K1, which we talked about earlier.
I was wondering, do those wings actually do anything, or is it really just a quadcopter that can fly sideways?
So
they do something, right?
Yeah. So
yeah.
So the wings provide the lift, but you still need to use the motors for stabilization. So you can't glide, for example. So one of the big advantages of a quad plane, right, is that you've got like redundant. You can glide or you can hover. You can't glide anymore in these. If you lose motor power, you're going to crash.
Easy to build though, I guess, as well. You don't have to worry about all the servos and things.
Yeah, it is.
pretty cool. Looks
Yeah,
good.
you could actually support this in copter as well. It's one of the sort of vehicles that could be either. And we added it as a plane, but it could easily be a copter if you wanted to, because there are little racing quads where people have got add-on wings, you know, to make the racing quads fly faster and more efficiently. And so there's this sort of, you know, crossover point between copters and planes, where this could have been done as a copter, in which case we would have had to have better support for flying sideways. And because it, you know, it flies nose down and nose up, and it very much flies like a plane for most of its time. It tends to take off for a few seconds and then it's flying on the wing most of its flight. So you'd have to support that in copter somehow, but
the big problem with supporting these things in copter is the thrust vector is not defined by the direction of the motors, which is what all of the position control and navigation assumes. The thrust vector gets, you know, moves from being defined by the motors to being defined by the wings, and we have no support or accounting for that at this stage. Yep.
Whereas and yeah, anyway, but it does do very smooth transitions. It flies really nicely, actually. Once we got it sort of, you know, dialed in. Many thanks to Henry for his help with testing on his one, and I've got one as well. And yeah, it does fly very nicely and reasonably good endurance, that sort of thing. It's a nice aircraft.
Yep.
The big problem
with
these aircraft. Yeah, the big problem with these aircraft is they fly really nicely until your first little crash and the wings get slightly distorted. In which case, after that point, as soon as the wings start actually flying,
this one's surprisingly well designed. I've had several looked like quite hard crashes. I picked it up and flew it again straight away. This particular one, the Swan K1, they've done a very good job of that. And I've come down quite hard a few times when I was working on the development of this, and it picked it up and, you know, flew again. And it's really surprisingly robust aircraft.
It is indeed. I've dropped it from 30 feet.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Do they have some yaw tilt on the motors? Like, so the motors aren't all in the same axis?
You can see it in the picture there. So 10 degrees, they've got 10 degrees in two axes. So I don't know what that adds up to for total angle, but, you know, 10 degrees pitched towards the middle of the aircraft and 10 degrees. Yeah, it's a massive amount. Or you can't, otherwise you couldn't roll it properly in fixed wing.
Exactly. And that's the big mistake that most of these aircraft do, is they just have a normal quad rotor and the yaw authority, the multi-rotor yaw authority just isn't enough to overcome any imperfection in the incidence of the.
You need a huge D-gain on the yaw axis, the VTOL yaw axis, for this to actually fly really well. And because it needs massive roll authority in fixed wing flight to overcome the wings to actually, so, you know, to get good roll control and good navigation. Yeah.
Well, that's what was being discussed with Andy's talk with yaw. Once you get to a certain, if you've got any thrust vectoring in yaw, that's where D-gain comes back into the equation. And with these small multi-rotors, there's because there's a bit of D-gain advantage as well. But any thrust vectoring for yaw enhancement, then you start adding D-gain back.
Yeah, I've found on the quad planes that have got any degree of tilt on the rotors, you definitely want some D-gain. All right, sorry for hijacking your talk. Keep going, Pete.
Right, so we also support control surfaces and motors, right? You don't have to jump to this control surfaceless aircraft. So this is Henry's box kite. So we saw this flying in his little demo video at the beginning. So in this case, you actually end up with sort of two ways of controlling the same thing. So we can yaw with differential torque on the motors, or you could use your elevons, and we could pitch by differential thrust, or you can use your elevons. So we actually have just introduced some new parameters for this, so you can actually scale up how much the control surfaces move relative to the motors. So particularly in yaw, you might find that the motors are working really hard to yaw the vehicle with differential torque, and your control surfaces are not really moving at all. So to sort of fix that, you might want to half your gain, so the motors work half as hard, and then you would set your scaling P here to 2. So it's sort of, you need to so the motors always have the same response. So to make the motors respond less, you reduce your gains, and then you make your control surfaces respond more by increasing these P gains. And it's just just one number, and it's a bit weird on these vehicles where you start to have multiple actuators for each axis. There's sort of 2 methods to actuate the same thing, and you have to weigh up sort of how hard you want to try with each actuator. And this is the sort of thing you could spend ages messing with this stuff. But in general, you want to sort of make best use of your control surfaces, particularly in yaw, where your motors are really have a hard time yawing the vehicle. You want to make the most of your control surfaces. And then you can use Q-assist speed, so we can actually stop using the motors for active stabilization once you have the control surfaces. So you could set Q-assist speed, for example, to automatically change from active motor control to sort of all motors the same throttle and use the control surfaces. We also have an option called, it's in Q options, motors only Q-assist. So that means that the motors still stabilize, but we use the plane controller for the control surfaces, and we use the I term from plane and 0 the copter plane term. So what it in practice, what this sort of means is that you have the motors for stabilization, and then the control surfaces are used sort of like trim tabs. That actually works really nicely. You have sort of really fast response from the motors, but they never like wind up really hard trying to achieve some offset, and it just uses the control surfaces to fight that sort of like constant offset. So that can work quite well in vehicles that sort of have control surfaces, but the control surfaces are not quite enough for, so on vehicles like this, where it's probably not aerodynamically stable necessarily. So the control surfaces are not quite enough to keep it stable in forward flight, but you don't want to be using the motors as much when you have got some control surfaces. So you can set this motors only Q-assist option, and then you can set this Q-tailsit motor mix to decide which motors stay on in forward flight. So in this example, you'd need all the motors on in forward flight. But if you had, say, a plus copter with 2 along the wings and a top and bottom, you might say, oh, well, I'm just going to keep my wing ones on and switch off the top 2 in forward flight. So there's a lot of options there. And of course, we do support, for any quad planes, we support custom motor mixers from scripting. So we've seen a few people say you would have like 8 motors along a sort of biplane like this, and things like that. So custom mixers, because you're sort of, because you're mounting the motors on the wings, you end up with a non-traditional copter motor layout. So you can use scripting to set that up. Not just tailsitters, you can works on copter and normal quad planes as well. But tailsitters is quite a common use of that. So this is a little look at transitions. So there's been loads of improvements to transitions, too many to mention. So we've got lots of new parameters in transition, and the key thing to come and look at is the pitch angle, basically. So you can see this is a transition into forward flight, so we're in the hover. And then the thing you'll immediately notice is this sort of jump. There's this big jump, so that's a 90-degree change between the reference frame of the controller. So we just do a sort of sharp step change, a handover from VTOL to forward. So that's what this jump is. So the attitude control view always reports the attitude control being used by the controller that is in charge. So the VTOL controller is in charge, so we're nosing down in VTOL, and then we continue nosing down in fixed wing. So you can see we jump from -45 to +45. So that's the 90-degree change in attitude that the tailsitter sees. So in this case, that's happening at 45 degrees. You can do it earlier or later. So that's Q tailsit angle. So you might quite commonly set this a bit larger. So you stay in that VTOL controller where you have super nice attitude control a bit longer. So as you start using the forward flight controller later when you've built up a little bit more airspeed. So you might not have got quite enough airspeed to start using the control surfaces only once you've got to 45 degrees. So you can change that. And we also have this Q tailsit rat forward. So that's basically the slope of this line. So that's the pitch rate that it uses for the transition, and it's held in the both phases. So both the VTOL phase and the fixed wing flight phase hold this this rate until it gets to your desired pitch angle. So if you're sat there with pitching up, it'll slowly do this pitch rate until it gets to whatever you're asking for, whatever the pilot is asking. So if you were sat there with full pitch down, it would continue this lovely straight transition rate line until it got to whatever pitch down you were asking for. So it should be a much smoother transition. We always end up with a bit of a jump as it switches controllers. So that's just that the I terms are not quite right yet. As we suddenly say, "Oh, quick, you're a plane now." And the key thing to look for is you want this transition fixed wing done message. So if you don't see that, there are a few other ones you might get. That you can get transition timeout, you can get roll errors. So if you're seeing other messages, it means you need to futz with your transition a little bit. Excuse me. So before you futz with transitions, make sure you've got a good VTOL and fixed wing tune. So for the most part, we'll survive a sort of untidy transition, no problem. Just go up a bit high and go for it. So that'll get you into fixed wing, and you can go and tune up fixed wing. And then once you've got a nice tune in VTOL and fixed wing, you can revisit your transitions and get them working really well. So if you're seeing like transition timeouts, it means that the actual pitch is not keeping up with the desired pitch very well. So it's taking longer than it expected. So it works out how long it should take. It knows what angle change you've got to do, and it knows what rate you're supposed to be doing. So if it takes too long, it'll time out. So in that case, you either need to improve your tune so that it matches your desired pitch better, or try a lower rate here so it doesn't move so fast, or potentially move your tailsitter angle so that it doesn't have to go so fast or go so far. So there's a few different things you can do to improve your transitions there. So this is going back the other way. So we've got all the same sort of the same stuff going the other way. So we've got an angle to VTOL. So again, you might find that the plane controller actually can't pitch up very hard. It's only got control surfaces to pitch up with. So it can't pitch up to 60 degrees or whatever. So you might need to set this a bit lower so that you do just a little bit of the pitch up with the plane controller, and then you do the rest of it in the VTOL controller, which has more authority typically. Again, we've got a parameter for the rate that you pitch up at. So you can see we're following that here. And then in this example, I must have had some forward pitch in. So you can see we follow that nice linear transition rate until we get to whatever the controller is asking for, and then it drops back to whatever loiter, in this case, whatever pitch loiter is asking for. So it doesn't like it won't merrily carry on to 0 and then come back. It'll get to what it's asking for and then stop limiting. So again, we see this big jump. So that's the controller handover. And then often we will see this spike. So this spike is just a race condition in logging, because we sort of instantaneously change modes when the mode request to change mode comes through, but we don't update our transition state until the next quad plane update comes through. So these big spikes are quite common. It's not the controller doing the wrong thing. It's just a race condition in logging. So you don't need to panic if you see the big spike here. So it's accidentally logged the forward flight attitude control view. So we're down here at 90 because it's logged the wrong attitude view. It's in fact, it's logged the VTOL view for one time step. So don't panic if you see these spikes. And again, we're looking for this transition VTOL done. Again, you can get timeouts if the desired pitch is not keeping up with, or if the actual pitch is not keeping up. So you might have to lower your transition rate or something like that to get this nice, happy transition complete message. So as well, for the transition to VTOL flight, we have a new parameter, Tailsit throttle VTOL. So this gives the throttle value that we use for the transition. So this is when you first start the transition until you get to that controller handover. So it just goes to a constant throttle, and then when the controller handover is done, it will use whatever throttle depending on the mode you're asking for. So this is stabilized, so it's jumped to there because that must have been where the throttle was, or the throttle stick was. So the thing you want to do here is get it as low as possible. So you'll often see tailsitters come shooting in really fast. They do their transition and climb, 10 meters or something as they shoot up into the air. So to try and stop it doing that, you want as low a throttle as you can in this transition phase. So on things like the Swan K1, you can actually use 0, and it works great. You just have to set your throttle mix parameters such that it will bump the average throttle just enough to maintain attitude control. So you can use very low. And again, if you set up this new min outflow velocity parameter, you can set a very low throttle, and then you rely on this min outflow to bump up the throttle to the minimum required. So you sort of set this low and then rely on the throttle mix parameters and this min outflow to bump up the throttle just as much as you need. So like I wouldn't set it straight to 0, but you can set this very low and rely on these other parameters, and that should mean, so on the Swan K1, you can get almost level transitions with no altitude gain if you sort of slow down a bit in fixed wing flight. Obviously, if you come along at full speed in fixed wing, you're still going to gain a bunch of altitude. But if you sort of slow down a bit, you can use this throttle level to minimize altitude gain through the transition. So we've got a lovely video here. So we've also got, I'll just speed it up a bit. We've also got weathervaning. So this applies to all quad planes, of course, but we've got some new weathervaning parameters. So you can automatically weathervane, and we've got some options that are super nice for tail sitters. So we've got the nose into the wind option that everyone is familiar with from normal quad planes. And you can see that's what the vehicle is doing there. So it's yawing around such that it is coming back to nose into the wind. And then this will be either way, so you can go nose or tail into the wind. So tail into the wind seems it's a bit of a funny name, but it is nose into the wind upside down, so it's leaning backwards into the wind. So that might be an advantage, right? Because you have a maximum of 90 degrees to go either way to get to this, rather than you might have to go a full 180 to get to nose into the wind. So this nose or tail into the wind only really works for tail sitters, and it minimizes the amount of yawing that you would have to do to get to that sort of ideal condition. We also support side into the wind. So, excuse me, we also support side into the wind. So you'll find if you have side into the wind, it will like present the minimum like area. So here it's doing side into the wind. So you can see when we were nose into the wind, we were having to pitch at about 30 degrees to keep on station. But if we go side into the wind, we're only having to roll at about 10 degrees. So that makes it a little bit easier to hold station potentially, especially if it's windy and you're right up against your angle limits. So you can see how much of a easier time it's having. You will find, of course, like nose into the wind, you sort of benefit from the lift on the wing a little bit more, but then so it might be more efficient in the hover, but then it makes it harder to descend because you've got this wing lift to work against, whereas side into the wind sort of takes that away. And then there's the option for only tail into the wind. So that's leaning in on your back. So you might want that for descending. It makes it a little bit like you won't have to lean so far into the wind because you'll make less lift upside down than you do the right way up. So there's sort of all these options, and we also have the ability to specify one that you might want to use for so there's enable, which is sort of the general case. Then you can override for takeoff and override for landing. So you might want to go side into the wind in your normal conditions. So you would set Weathervane enable to side into the wind. For takeoff, you might want to go nose into the wind. So as you sort of take off and then transition into the wind. And then for landing, you might want to go tail into the wind. So you have this advantage of not having to lean so far. And for landing as well, it sort of depends how your landing gear is set up, which one might be better. And of course, it's also useful for quad planes. Normal quad planes, you might want to have, because you can override to disable. So you might be taking off in a valley or something, and you lay your quad plane down on the ground in the direction you'd like it to transition in. So you can override the weathervaning to be disabled on takeoff, so it won't yaw around just after it's taken off and transition in an unexpected direction. It'll just transition in the direction you want, and then for the rest of the flight, it'll just weathervane as normal. So there's a lot of new capabilities, not only for tail sitters, but for all quad planes. Of course, I wouldn't recommend using any of them except nose into the wind on a normal quad plane, but we've got all these other options that should be really good for tail sitters. So that's basically the meat of the talk done. There's a few videos and stuff to watch. If anyone's got any questions, I'll go and have a look on the various chats as well. This is Marco's very cool Explorer, by the way. So it's actually all 3D printed. You can see he's flying around there.
Looking forward to that being widely available. The Marco's on the live stream, by the way. So hello, Marco. Noticed him commenting there. So fantastic. Thank you so much for all your effort that you've put in. You've put in a huge amount of effort into tail sitters over the past year. It's been absolutely brilliant. It's really taken us from, really mediocre support to really good support for tail sitters. It's been great. And also thank you to Marco for, constantly nagging us, and particularly Pete for responding to those nags, to, he's a very exacting user and really pushed us to get the tail sitter support so much better. It was really good having a user like that, pushing things. And Henry, of course, with his massive amount of testing he did with all sorts of different vehicles. Yeah, oh, that's my one. That's my S1K1. Yep, got that in there. So really good.
Yeah, lots of demo videos at the end here. Yeah, it's great having lots of people testing.
That's
and
flying still really nicely now. Yeah, zero height gain on back transition.
There's still a bunch of little improvements we can make, like landing detection is one that we need to improve on tail sitters, and there's still a few little transition improvements we can make, but
yeah, there's still a little twitch. I saw it in your graph actually, a little twitch as it goes between the two phases of the going from fixed wing to VTOL. There's a, as it hands over between those two controllers, there's it's not, if you were to shift the graph up by 90 degrees, it wouldn't quite be a straight line. There's a little squiggle in between.
Yeah, so let's go and find it.
there. So you see the green line
This one
there.
is the worst one.
Next
Yeah.
one. That's the worst one. But I was thinking the next one, that one, even that
This
one
little-
there.
Yeah.
See, that wouldn't, you know, quite extrapolate from the green line above. It's like it pauses. And then yeah. So it actually goes backwards a little bit by a few
Yep.
degrees. And so I think we could, you know, improve that a little bit. But you know, these are minor things. And so it's streets ahead. And I really like, even on ordinary quad planes, I love having the weather vaning option to not weather vane on takeoff. That's really important. So I know I point the plane in the right direction. I know it's going to transition in that direction and not head into a tree when the winds are crosswind. And I often take off quite close to trees because I like standing under the shade. So that's been a really useful option for me.
Peter, a quick question, can I?
Sure.
When you say that you're weather vaning, do you plan to have any kind of detection of the best weather the best facing the wind, so that it drifts the least? So doing a 360 rotation and see where does it drift more or less in this case?
So the weather vaning is driven by, depending on what you have selected, it's driven by like roll or pitch angle. So it just yaws until it minimizes its roll. So it sort of, you have to be in position control mode, of course. So it doesn't like it if you fly about. It'll sort of weather vane.
Like on this video, it's weather vaning, but it's not controlled by the flight controller. It's manual, right?
Yeah, so this video is all manual flying about. This is actually a really old video, but
Yeah.
I like it because it proves that you don't have to be a flying wing. People seem to have linked flying wings and tail sitters. You can only do flying wing tail sitters. Normal plane tail sitters work great.
But when it does this, shouldn't be also optimal to have a routine that would detect the best position for being like this vertical?
Yeah, so it sort of does that. It rotates to minimize its sort of sideways effort, sort of automatically. It would be nice to like use our wind speed estimate so that it like automatically sort of straight away goes to a best guess, and then weather vanes are using this sort of roll method for the rest. Like once it's gone to its best guess as a starting point.
Okay, thanks. Nice work, by the way. And Marco too. Robustini is doing a great job with that 3D printed model.
Definitely.
So
Good
question
stuff.
for you.
Oh, yep.
So it's really cool to see the disk theory approach towards the high alpha as you transition. That's actually one of my first research projects ever was high alpha tail prop hanging. One question is how fussy that getting that you know, the amount of control surfaces in the prop wash versus not, how fussy that actually is. Sort of what we were doing, it was a sort of dual thing, getting stall detection, we as well as via aerodynamic sensing. So we had, you know, lots and lots of pressure ports, but you don't really need that many. We had one or two just in the prop wash itself to get you that idea, and outside as well on the control surfaces, to get you an idea of how much actual pressure you had on the control surfaces. We did it for all of them because it was just a 3D aircraft, but just how fussy that is.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too bad. Like you and again, like the nearer hover you fly, the sort of more correct it is, right? The less it matters. So if you're just hovering, it doesn't make a huge difference. If you really razz about, it's actually not too bad if you end up with a bit of a lower gain than ideal when you're going fast. It sort of doesn't really matter that much. We don't want to be right on the edge all the time. So it does work well, and I think one of the nice advantages is like descending. It works well, sort of boosts up your gains nicely when descending. again, you have to really razz about in like Actuator or Stabilize to really see what can happen. And you can just tune it up. So you sort of do these test flights, full throttle, get lots of airspeed, chop the throttle. So you want sort of high throttle, high airspeed, low throttle, high airspeed, low airspeed, high throttle, low airspeed, low throttle. So there's sort of 4 conditions that test the sort of extremes of the scaling, and you just try them all and play about with that disk loading parameter to get rid of any oscillations. As I say, it's not. It sort of has units, but I didn't give it proper units in the param description because you do need to sort of tune it in a bit.
It might be worth adding a bit of safety on that VO, you know, so if you do set it a bit too high, you can bring the aircraft down.
So it is still constrained by your throttle mix. So if you've got low throttle mix, it should be okay. But it is possible, as you say, to make it just climb away if you set it too high.
All right. All right, if that's the end of the questions, then thank you, Pete, very much for the great talk and all the development effort over the last year on Tailsitters and many, many other things. You've been an absolute star over the last year. It's been fantastic, the development you've been doing. So,